Edward Brown, host of The Best of Investing, here to remind you to tune in this week on Saturday at 8 p.m. Our guest is going to be Kevin Kim. You're not going to want to miss this show. That's The Best of Investing on Saturday at 8 p.m. Welcome. You're listening to The Best of Investing. I'm your host, Edward Brown. Our phone number is 888-912-1190. Use that number to answer the trivia questions for a 5-pack tanning certificate given away during the show. That certificate's not sponsored by the radio station, but by Tanbella Tanning Salon with 2 locations in San Francisco and 1 in Marin. And it's worth a little over $100, so it's a nice little gift we're giving away. Today, we do have a special guest, Dan Deppen, who is the owner of Call the Underwriter. And let's see, the title of this episode is called Creating Quality Seller Finance Notes. We'll get into that in just a minute. I'm going to read a short bio here. Dan is a real estate investor and underwriting expert specializing in seller financing. He's the owner of Call the Underwriter, where he helps investors create compliant, high-quality notes. With a background in engineering and tech, Dan brings a data-driven approach to creative financing. Dan, welcome back to The Best of Investing. We've had you on before.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. Okay. So first, let's get into exactly like the definition of what a seller finance note is.
Yeah, so a seller finance note is just when someone sells a property and then the seller retains the mortgage. So instead of the buyer, say, going to a bank and getting other financing or paying cash, generally the buyer's making some down payment to the seller, and then the seller is basically playing bank and holding the loan. Now, these could be, investor loans if the buyer has it as, a rental property, but it's often, when people say seller finance, they often also kind of mean owner-occupied consumer loans as well, which have kind of like a different set of rules that apply to them.
Okay. And you help your clients create these notes, don't you?
I do, yeah. So when someone's creating a loan, like number one, getting the loan terms right to maximize the value is important. So that's something I kind of do, off to the side for folks. I'm always happy to talk through that with people. But then our main business is then the underwriting and the Dodd-Frank compliance. So if you're creating a seller finance loan, you don't necessarily need to have a licensed RMLO involved if you're doing, 3 or less per year. We are licensed in some places, but you still need to follow a lot of other consumer laws. So like kind of the big one is Dodd-Frank, which means you have to validate your borrower has the ability to repay the loan. And then there's some other things like TRID that say you have to send certain disclosures to your borrower, 7 business days ahead of time before you close and 3 business days ahead of time. And that's where we really help. So we collect all the information from the borrower, figure out that's income, look at credit, do the underwriting, tell you whether the loan is going to be compliant or not. And we also make our own recommendations on whether or not to extend credit and then provide those disclosures.
Okay. And it's funny because I'm trying to remember, Call the Underwriter. Is that fairly new title?
No, actually, so Call the Underwriter was started in 2017, I believe, originally by Russ O'Donnell in Arizona. And I've done a lot of non-performing notes. I think I might have talked about that last time. And, I had used Call the Underwriter probably 5 or 6 times to originate seller finance loans, because if I get an REO, I like to sell on seller finance if possible and create a new note and keep going. But I actually acquired it towards the end of last year. So now I've been, working on scaling it out and expanding it quite a bit.
Okay. When we come back from our break, I do want to get into like generally the kind of terms that you're looking for these notes, how much of a down payment percentage wise, the interest rates and all that kind of fun stuff. All right, here we're going to go to our first trivia question here. First question is, how much faster are 6G speeds versus 5G speeds? I guess we're talking like the phone, probably. Call 888-912-1190. The first caller with the correct answer is going to win that tanning certificate, which again is worth about $100. Do want to make a mention here for Transcendence Theater. They've got some awesome Broadway type shows in Sonoma, in an outdoor theater. The weather's always seems to be good, and the shows are fantastic. Check them out, transcendencetheater.com. Stay with us. You're listening to The Best of Investing. Don't touch that dial. We're going to be right back. Welcome back to The Best of Investing. I'm Edward Brown, your host, along with my special guest, Dan Deppen from Call the Underwriter. First trivia question, how much faster are 6G speeds versus 5G speeds? Dan, what's your answer?
My answer is 1G.
1G.
That should be pretty easy. Yeah, that's pretty
Now,
easy.
now, if you have to say like how many times faster, what would you
Yeah,
think?
percentage, I have no clue. I'm going to say 4 times as fast.
Actually,
That's
it's
my guess.
100 times. It's 100 times faster. Isn't that
Oh,
crazy?
wow.
I looked it
That's
up on the
interesting.
internet, so it's got to be true.
So the tinfoil hat people will be like 100 times as concerned, because I know like when they went to 5G, there were all the
Right.
conspiracy theories. So yeah, you're going to need a thicker tinfoil hat for the
That's
6G.
right. Yeah, it was like in Jaws. We're going to need a bigger tinfoil hat.
Nigger boat, yeah.
Before we get back to asking Dan some questions, also want to make a mention here for Action Whitewater Adventures. They provide the best rafting experience in the North Bay, from beginners to advanced rafters. Check them out because we're in the season now. Check them out at actionwhitewater.com for rafting trips. All right, Dan, when you help create seller carryback notes for people, generally what kind of terms? I know they have to follow Dodd-Frank, but how much of a down payment do you usually suggest? Interest rate, how many year mortgage, etc.
Yeah, so that's good you brought that up, because getting the terms is like really critical for maximizing the value of the loan. So on the down payment, so that's one of the key terms, especially if you ever go to sell the note, that the buyer is going to care about. For seller finance notes, it's generally a little different than the bank world. Most of the ones I see, people are around 10%.
Okay.
If you're getting down to 5%, that's pretty sketchy, although I see a lot there. If you're at like 15%, you're really kind of in the top tier for seller finance. If you can get to 20, that's like A++, right? But
But are you talking
really,
about writing the note for that?
yeah,
'Cause
when you do the deal, that would be like the down payment that the borrower makes. If you get a 15% down
oh,
payment from the
gotcha.
borrower,
Yeah.
you're kind of like in the upper tier of seller finance transactions. Obviously, 20
Okay.
is the gold standard and is better, but don't see a ton
Yeah.
at 20%. The
Because they
majority
can
are like,
usually they might be able to get a bank loan at that. Yeah, I was wondering. I
right.
thought at first I thought you were talking about the interest rate, and I go, who's writing interest rates at 20%?
Oh,
But
no, no,
okay,
no, no, no. Yeah, so that's the down payment. Yeah, so the
that's down
interest
payment. Okay.
rate,
Yeah.
most of them are in the 9 to 10% range. So
Yeah.
with seller finance, right, like the interest rates are typically always higher than bank rates. One of
Yeah.
the kind of rookie mistakes sometimes people make is they look up, they go, oh, banks are lending at 6%, so I'll create my loan at 6, or maybe I'll give the borrower a break and do it at 5. And that really can crush the value of your loan, right? Because if someone's selling the loan,
Yeah.
the buyer is usually looking for at least like a 10% return plus. So if you create a loan with a 5% interest rate, you can't sell that without a massive
Discount.
haircut.
Yeah.
So the majority, I would say, are in the 9 to 10% range. If they're in Texas, they're often like a little bit higher. I see like a lot of 11, 12 there. You always want to check with your real estate attorney, though, to make sure there aren't any like state specific rules. Like I know Pennsylvania has some caps that float with the prime rate. I think they actually have a max, it's like 7.5% now, which is like
Oh
almost
wow.
lend at. So that gets weird, but kind of 9 or 10% is the rule. And then the loan term is the one that I think often gets overlooked. So all things being equal, a shorter loan term gives you a more valuable loan.
Sure.
And
Because
the reason for that is, yeah, like let's say you create the loan at 9% and your buyer's discounting it to 10%, it's less of a haircut if it's amortized over, say, 10 years versus 30. The
Now,
other
the thing is, well, if you're, I was gonna say, if you're doing a consumer loan, then you've got to be careful about, you can't really have like a due on sale clause. And you can't, you also have to potentially worry about usury unless, you're licensed and that sort of thing. So how do
Oh yeah,
you
so
get,
that plays into the interest rate. Yeah.
yeah, because also, trying to get a borrower to do like a fully amortized 10-year loan is tough because
It
the
is,
payments.
yeah. There's no free lunch, right? So if you got the shorter loan term, your loan's a little more valuable. The cool thing about it, if the borrower can afford it, shorter loan terms are considered more borrower friendly by regulators because they're paying principal down
True.
faster. Now, the thing I think you were getting at is if you do have a shorter term, you're going to have a higher payment.
Monthly.
So one of the
Yeah,
things we also look at is the borrower's debt to income
yeah.
ratio. So there's no free lunch, right? Like if you say do a 10-year term, the borrower might be willing to do that, but that might make their debt to income too high. So there's no free lunch with that. Like it doesn't always
Yeah.
work out. Just I just advise people like don't necessarily like default to a 30-year term. If it works out at a shorter term, and the borrower's interested in that, then that can kind of work out potentially better for everyone.
How many people who create notes are immediately interested in selling them versus, you know what, I'm just going to hold it for a long-term annuity?
Most hold it. I would say the majority are interested in holding them. The ones that are more interested in selling them tend to be the ones who they've got their seller finance model, and then people have a
Yep.
tendency to scale. And then just like other forms of investing, like at some point people run out of capital. And so sometimes people get to the point where they want to start selling the notes to recapitalize to do more. Yeah.
Gotcha. So that totally makes sense. And then, the other part of it is even if you have a long-term note, they're almost always going to have a due on sale clause, and people usually stay in their houses, no more than 10 years, let's say. So it'll end up being a short-term loan anyway, probably.
Yeah, I think
Relatively
like what,
short.
7 years is the average,
7
something like
years, yeah,
that. I
it's
haven't
usually,
looked at the numbers in a long time.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, here's our second trivia question. What is the name of Batman's butler? All right. Call 888-912-1190. First caller with the correct answer wins that tanning certificate. Again, it's worth over $100. What is the name of Batman's butler? And we'll give you kind of extra credit if you can give the full name. All right. Stay with us. You're listening to The Best of Investing. I'm Edward Brown, along with my special guest, Dan Deppen. Don't touch that dial. We're going to be right back. Welcome back to The Best of Investing. Edward Brown here, along with Dan Deppen. Our second trivia question. What is the name of Batman's butler?
I have no idea. I'm gonna guess Jeeves. That's what I'm
No,
going with.
okay, so we're going back in time. Alfred. But we're
Alfred.
going
No,
to
that rings a bell. I used to watch like Batman reruns when I was a kid and
yeah,
movies and stuff and the old what Adam West
that's right, exactly. And
things. Yeah, I
the
watched
extra
those, but I didn't
credit,
remember the butler. Yeah.
Butler Alfred, and his last name was Pennyworth.
Oh, I didn't remember
Pennyworth.
that
A
at
lot of
all.
people don't know that one. All right. So, Dan, we're talking about seller carryback notes. And what are some, well, let's see here. Okay. So, we already talked about what makes a quality seller finance note, a good interest rate, shorter term. What are some of the most common mistakes investors make when originating notes?
Yeah, the big one. Well, I mean, the number one mistake, and I would say most seller finance notes fall into this bucket, which is they just don't vet the borrower or do any of the compliance stuff. Like the vast majority of seller finance paper that gets created is just Wild West stuff.
Yeah.
That's not real good. And then I would say amongst the people that kind of have an idea, of what to do, setting up, the terms wrong, like getting the interest rate too low, like we talked about. But the other one that's kind of sneaky and I think super important is not pre-screening the borrower. Like one of the most common mistakes is somebody's, they're selling their property, they find a buyer, they get really excited and they just want to roll with the first
Yeah.
person they have. And the reason that's bad, what happens to people is they find a buyer, they put it under contract, they go through the underwriting process, and maybe it takes a while for the borrower to get their information in. Then we got to do the underwrite. Like a little time goes by, and they get to the end, and then they find out like their borrower is kind of marginal,
Yeah.
or just bad. And now they get kind of feel kind of painted into a corner. It's like, okay, do I stick with this borrower that's not so great, or
Yeah.
do I start over finding someone else? And most people in that spot grit their teeth and stick with the bad borrower. So the way not to get painted into that corner is to do like a really thorough pre-screening ahead of time. So like on our website, we have a one-page guide on how to do that. It's not that difficult, but like you can suss out, 95% of the red flag type issues. And the other thing I
Sure.
advise people to do too is, hopefully you can get multiple borrowers and kind of talk to them and get an idea, right? Because the value of a loan, if you do have a borrower with a bigger down credit, better uh, down payment,
Okay,
you're
yeah.
gonna have a vastly more valuable loan than the one that's like kind of borderline
Yeah.
compliant. So I would say, like, I know everybody wants to go fast and it makes sense, but be a little careful and like don't necessarily take like the first person that comes along.
Yeah, because the problem is once you sell the house, take back the note, if the borrower defaults, now you got to go through a foreclosure all over again.
Yeah, and it's not fun, right? And I would say like people who are new to this and have not done notes or done like non-performing notes, tend to underestimate how challenging the foreclosure could potentially be. Because I've done a lot of them from notes that
Yeah.
I bought. And yeah, sometimes, it's a non-judicial state. The borrower doesn't fight. Everything is super smooth.
Yeah.
Yeah, they be no problem. But then, you get ones where the borrower fights. You have random court delays. I had one where I was delayed because the judge passed away and they had to like find another one. And then, the other thing they'll do is, file bankruptcy like the day before the sheriff's auction. They got to go through that whole process, which is very expensive and very time consuming and whatnot. So yeah, it's foreclosure is not the layup that sometimes people assume it is.
Oh no, been there, done that. And
Yeah.
what do you charge for you? Before we get to our break, what do you charge for your services? And give out your information in case people want to help get help creating these notes.
Yeah. So the underwriting fee is a flat $7.99.
Okay.
Because the work we do is kind of the same, whether it's a small loan or a big loan.
Yeah.
But then what most lenders do, what I recommend is, as the lender, right, you are the bank and you can charge fees to your borrower when you close. I mean, within certain limits, there's also compliance stuff around that. But most lenders will uh, pass on that $7.99 fee to their borrower when they close. So really, to you as the lender, it should cost nothing, but it's the flat $7.99 fee. But if you want to learn more about how our process works, on the Call the Underwriter website, there's a lot of information. I've got like a how it works video that kind of walks through the whole process. Or you can always email me directly at dan@calltheunderwriter.com.
I like that. Dan, calltheunderwriter.com. Nice and
Yeah.
simple. All right. Let's see here. Here's our third trivia question. What is the only U.S. state whose capital does not have a McDonald's? That's our trivia question. Call 888-912-1190. First caller with correct answer wins that tanning certificate. Do want to also make a mention here. The Pacific Private Money has their arrival fund. It's paying 10%. It is a fund. It's backed by First Deeds of Trust. Check them out at pacificprivatemoney.com and look for their arrival fund. Again, they're paying 10%, and the best part of it is it's fairly liquid loans because they are buying the loan, or excuse me, they're underwriting the loans, they're funding them, and then they're selling them right off to big institutions. So the money comes right back in, goes back on the conveyor belt, and they keep doing this over and over again. And there's only a 1-year hold for investors. So check them out, pacificprivatemoney.com. All right, stay with us. You are listening to The Best of Investing. Don't touch that dial. We are going to be right back. Welcome back to The Best of Investing one more time. I'm Edward Brown, your host, along with my special guest, Dan Deppen of Call the Underwriter. And our third trivia question, which is the only U.S. state whose capital does not have a McDonald's?
That's got to be Juneau, Alaska. That seems most likely. That's my guess.
You know what? That would be a good guess. Actually, it's Montpelier, Vermont.
Oh, okay.
The
I've
only
never
one.
been there, so I don't know.
I haven't either, but
That's
I
weird.
guess
Though.
they
I
don't
still
want.
would have thought they would have had one.
Yeah, you'd think
I
so.
would think like supply chain. Okay, maybe you can't do Alaska because that's little towns like all
Yeah,
strung out. But yeah,
actually that would have been my guess. Except I know the answer just because I looked at it
yeah.
up on the internet to get the question. So when people have made those common mistakes in originating notes, what kind of backlash, what kind of issues have? I mean, we've talked about not having a like a borrower defaults and you have to go into foreclosure, but what if you get like the documents wrong?
The main downside, in my opinion, is that your loan is then not as liquid, right? So one of the cool things about loans that sometimes people don't appreciate is you can do a lot with them. Like you can hold them, collect payments, you can
Yeah,
sell the loan, you can sell a partial of the loan, right? So you could sell like a year or two of payments, like what I do a lot, you can use them as collateral and borrow against them and do loan hypothecations, right? Because most of the people who create notes are they're creative people. They're into all kinds of stuff. So there's an advantage in being able to maneuver with your
yeah,
loan. But if you created a bad loan, you haven't done the compliance stuff, which a lot of buyers will care about, especially like the institutional ones.
huh?
But if you've got all the compliance stuff and you've shown that you've vetted your borrower and you've got the credit report and the income docs and the 1008 with the DTI,
Huh?
your loan is a lot more valuable. You can make a lot more moves with it. Like one of the interesting things about the note world is your institutional type buyers will pay the most.
Yeah,
Like in most markets, the retail buyers pay more, the institutional
yeah,
pay less. But in notes, it's like reversed. So
yeah,
your ability to get liquid on different things and maneuver is just more limited and will be more expensive. That's really the biggest downside. I mean, yeah, you do have the risk of default and getting into foreclosures, and if you didn't follow the consumer rules and you foreclose and you get fought, you could run into a enforceability issue depending on what kind of mood the judge is
yeah.
in. But I think really it's the financial flexibility is really the biggest penalty, and it's a little sneaky because that doesn't show up till down the line.
Yeah, and then sometimes I think if I'm not mistaken, if you're found in default on your terms, that all the payments that were made by the borrower just reduce the principal. That potentially that's an issue.
It could, yeah, like depending
Yeah,
on the nature of the problem,
yeah,
that you had, and honestly, like a lot of the stuff is up to the judge's discretion and how it goes. But if you can show you did your homework, I followed TRID, I got the 1008, I did all the stuff. Well,
yeah.
then you're in good shape because borrowers will say crazy things. Like having done a lot of non-performers, um, when you foreclose, like they'll try to throw anything at the wall that might stick.
Sure.
So you don't want to hand them something like a compliance thing.
Gotcha. Okay. And how do I know if my borrower has the ability to repay?
Yeah. So what we'll do is we'll get for one, we'll get their income documentation, right? And validate what their income is. And that's a different process based on whether they're a W-2 wage earner or self-employed or maybe collecting like Social Security, VA benefits, that type
Huh?
of thing. And then we'll pull their credit and see what other monthly debt obligations they have. So then we know the PITR on the loan and then their other monthly debts, balanced against their income. And from there, we can figure out their debt to income
Do you have to
ratio.
follow any specific rule percentage wise?
So that's interesting because that's a gray area. So Dodd-Frank says you have to validate your borrower has the ability to repay, but they don't actually define that in terms of like a strict debt to income. So what we do is we use some of the government programs and what they allow as anchor points. So we use 57% debt to income as a threshold for compliance. Now, that doesn't mean that me as a lender is okay with that. Like I personally want something lower than that, but
Yeah.
that's one bar where we're like, okay, if the borrower meets that, we're comfortable. That's okay from a compliance standpoint. But then there's always mitigating factors. You could have a borrower that has, a 55% debt to income, but we determine that they don't have the ability to repay if they have a low residual income. So, like, let's say you have a borrower that's on disability benefits and they collect a small amount every month. Their debt to income is 50%. but they live in California and have 5 kids, right, which means that their debt
Yeah.
to income could be low, but then there's not enough money left over after that to pay the bills and
Good
buy
point.
groceries. Like likewise, you could have a borrower that has a 60% DTI, but they make 30K a month, but they've got like this giant boat and 4 cars and all this stuff. And there's plenty of money left over, to repay the loan. So, it's not always as black and white as people would like, but that's where, we come in to kind of understand those mitigating factors and make a determination.
Gotcha. Okay. We're going to be going to another break here in just a minute. When we come back, I do want to hear about some success stories you had and even throw in a horror story once in a while. That's always kind of
Sure.
interesting to hear. All right. There's no trivia question for this round, but audience, again, stay with us. You're listening to The Best of Investing. Don't touch that dial because we are going to be right back with some closing comments as well. Welcome back to the Best of Investing. Last time for today, I'm Edward Brown, your host, along with my special guest, Dan Deppen from Call the Underwriter. No trivia question, but Dan, give us a success story.
Um, so I mean, on the underwriting side, I mean, a lot of these, right? Like we do the underwriting up front, and then you don't necessarily know how everything turns out, or it turns out, over years. But
Uh-huh.
sometimes you get ones where everything in the file just comes out super clean. Like I've had
Okay.
ones where the borrower just has like a 750 credit score. They've got a ton of income. Their debt to income ratio is like 15%, and they made a good down payment, and just like, everything is gold star. Those are
Yeah.
like super easy to do, right? Like really good loans. And that investor is going to be able to do whatever the heck they want with that loan. They can probably sell it for above par, right? On the downside, the ones that make me sad are the ones where sometimes, the borrower's got an underlying lien. They're paying on the property. They got to get it sold because, it's costing them out of pocket. So they're like under
Yeah.
pressure to get this thing going. Maybe they're having trouble selling the property, and then they finally find a borrower. But, the borrower's making like a 4% down payment. Their credit's pretty suspect. They've got, past accounts charged off, and it's just maybe compliant, but dicey from
Yeah.
from a risk perspective. And they go with it because they're like, I got to get this monkey off my back and
Yeah.
get income, coming in. Those are the ones that are kind of tough because you wish they kind of were under a little bit less pressure so they could take more time and find somebody better, because they might be dealing with this again, in the future.
Gotcha. Okay. And are there any sizes of loans that you look for, like as an investor?
As an investor, if I am, buying loans, it's really kind of all over the map. For me personally, it often kind of comes down to how much cash I have to deploy, right? So I think we were talking offline, earlier. I've got a loan that's paying off in my self-directed IRA. So like ideally I would find a loan that kind of fits that size. From a portfolio management perspective, there's, a little bit of strategy, you can get into. Like on one hand, you could buy a bunch of smaller loans and spread your bets out,
Mhm.
to case one defaults. The problem is now, though, you've got kind of all the admin management of, doing those transactions and doing the loan
Yeah.
onboarding and keeping up, with the portfolio.
Well,
On the other hand,
do you service all the loans yourself, or do you hire?
oh no, I don't service any of them. For a consumer loan, I really highly recommend using a licensed loan servicer.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing too. If you're setting up the loan, you can put in there that the borrower pays for the servicing fees, which are usually like 35 bucks a
Yeah.
month. I've never seen anybody push back on that, because there's a whole other host of compliance things that the servicer takes care of that you as an individual will never in your life be able to
Gotcha.
keep up with. And when I've done foreclosures, the number one thing borrowers try to throw at the wall is they'll say, oh, I sent the payments, the servicer lost it. Which if it's a licensed servicer, they probably didn't lose it. You're just in a better position to combat that kind of stuff.
Gotcha. Dan, give out your information one more time.
Yeah, so you can find out more about us at calltheunderwriter.com, or you can always email me directly with questions at dan@calltheunderwriter.com.
Sounds good. All right. First, we have a quick little silly joke of the week. I was thinking about starting my own bakery, making bundt cakes, donuts, and bagels. I'm going to call it Whole Foods. And
Nice.
here's our thoughts for the day. So I asked my doctor if I could sew up my own wound, and he said, suture yourself. Thought that was pretty cute. Okay.
Yeah.
And last one here. If I'm ever on life support, unplug me and then plug me back in. We'll see if that works. All right, audience, tune in next week to The Best of Investing. We're going to be giving away more free prizes for answering trivia questions. Thanks for listening. On behalf of our team, I'm Edward Brown, wishing you the best of investing. So long.